In this game, David Bronstein played his favorite King's Indian defense. He sacrificed his queen in the opening for two bishops, pawn, and very strong initiative. So he is the inventor of this variation, this queen sacrifice, and played it first time in 1956 against Boris Spassky, shocking everyone. However, he afterwards, later in that game, made some inaccurate moves and lost the game. The game I'm gonna show you now was played about 40 years after Spassky game and in one of the simul's. So he improved this variation and this time he won. So let's see how this happened. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6. This is King's Indian, d6, and f3, Zemish variation. The idea of f3 move is to support e4 pawn, also take under control g4 square, which is very important as white is going to play bishop e3 and knight won't be able to jump to g4, disturbing the bishop. And after bishop e3, white is going to play queen e2, creating a battery on this diagonal. And after black castles, white is going to start pawn storm on king's side by playing g4. As you see, f3 pawn also supports g4 pawn. h4, then bishop will go to h6, then h5, then white is going to open the h file, and after black takes back, white is going to exchange bishops, and after king takes g7, queen will jump on h6 supported by rook, and then after making the knight move, white is going to checkmate on h7. So this is the main idea of Zemish variation. So Bronstein played e5, immediately attacking the center. At first sight, this move looks bad because white can exchange on e5, then exchange queens, and that would lead to the loss of the right to castle, and black king will stay in the center and be vulnerable. However, it's not the case at all. Let's see, if white plays d takes e, exchange of queens, bishop g5. Black has a very strong move, c6. This is a key move in this position, vacating c7 square for the king, where king would be safely placed. For example, after castle's queenside check, king c7. So, and besides that, this pawn on c6 is very strong as it controls very important squares, central squares, and knight cannot disturb the king neither from b5 nor d5. And black is definitely not worse in this position, to say the least. And white also has a problem with the weakness on d4, as c4 and e4 pawns are advanced. Now d4 square is weak. So that's why after e5, white didn't take on e5 and played d5, grabbing more space. Now you see c6 and e6 under white control, so knight cannot go to c6, bishop cannot move to e6, and besides that, this d5 move also blocked the center, and the bishop on g7 is bad now, as it's blocked by its own pawn on e5. However, this d5 move has a drawback, which is the weakening of c5 square, where a black knight will be placed very well. So black played knight h5. This is also a typical move in King's Indian. The idea is after castling to play f5 and starting the expansion on king's side. So later black usually plays f4, g5, g4, and so on. So rook would be good on either on f file, or it can later move to g file. And also knight can jump to f4, and also knight h5 move opened the queen's diagonal. So that's the idea of knight h5 maneuver. So white played bishop e3, castles, queen d2, and now Bronstein made a move that at first sight looks strange, queen h4 check. It can be it looks strange as white can play g3, forcing at first sight forcing queen to move away. However, it's not the case, as you will see. If instead of g3, white, for example, played queen f2, that would lead to exchange of queens, and after exchange of queens, white won't have any chances to for successful attack, as without the attacks that I talked about, g4, h4, h5, bishop h6. As without queens, it's impossible to create it's possible, but very problematic to create successful attack. And if instead of queen f2, white played bishop f2, queen would just retreat to e7, where it's better placed than on its initial square, as rooks are connected now. And bishop is placed worse on f2 than on e3, because on e3 it was also attacking, controlling the very important diagonal on the king side. That's why the most logical move is g3, which was played in our game. And now Bronstein took on g3 with knight. Now, of course, white cannot take immediately with pawn, because the rook is under attack. However, white can pin the knight. Of course, not with bishop, because if bishop f2, knight would take on f1, attacking the queen, and after bishop takes h4, knight takes d2, king takes, black is simply pawn up. But what if white pins the knight with a queen, threatening to take the knight with a queen next move? Here, Bronstein found his brilliant move, novelty, and I offer you to pause the video and find this move. So the idea is to sacrifice queen for two bishops, pawn, and strong initiative. Knight takes f1. So first black gets one bishop. After queen takes h4, the second bishop. And also black is a pawn up, because when black took on g3. And also black is threatening to take on c4 and also fork on c2. So king e2. In Spassky game, the position was almost the same. Instead of castles, Bronstein in that game played knight a6. However, it was more or less the same, and in that game, Bronstein took on c4. So getting the second pawn, two bishops and two pawns for the queen. However, that wasn't the best move, because after b3, the knight moved to b6, and black pieces weren't very active. However, position was still equal, but then later Bronstein made some more mistakes and lost. However, instead of knight takes c4, which looks the most natural, taking the pawn, there is a stronger move, improvement, which Bronstein made in this game. He played knight c2. The idea is to place the knight with check on a very active central d4 square, and also attacks the rook, so with tempo. So now if rook moves, knight will check on d4. That's why white played here a knight b5. So if now black takes on a1, white would take on c7 and taking rook next move. That's why Bronstein, and also the knight from b5 defends the important d4 square. So if knight checks, white can always take back with a knight. So Bronstein plays knight a6, defending c7, and now rook c1 and knight d4 check. So knight takes, e takes. However, after this exchange, black gets passed pawn, strong passed pawn, and also e-file is open. And as you see, while black king is safe, white king isn't safe at all. It's in the center. And this material advantage, it doesn't play a serious role here because white cannot use the queen actually effectively, and cannot create any attack on king side, as black doesn't have weaknesses. All weaknesses under black's control, because black has a very strong, important dark square bishop, while white doesn't have a dark square bishop to put it on h6. Exchange creates some problems for black. So knight h3, bishop d7, continuing the development, rook g1. So what to do for black now? There is a very important rule that when you have two bishops, it's always a good idea to open up the game, to open as many lines and diagonals as possible, because when the position is closed, it's difficult to use bishops. But when it's open, bishops become very active and strong. So Bronstein now starts to open the lines and diagonals and files. So first he starts with queenside, b5. So if white takes on b5, of course black takes with a bishop, and the bishop with check, bishop becomes very active. That's why white plays b3, defending the pawn. It's important to defend it, as black was threatening to take on c4, and if rook takes, then bishop will come to b5, pinning the rook. That's why b3, b takes c, b takes c. So after this exchange, you see b file is open, and also what is very important, c5 square. Now knight will be placed on c5 very well, and it will stay there forever, as before b5 move. In this position, if knight moves to c5, white can always play b4, disturbing the knight. However, after b5 and exchange, now white doesn't have b4 move, and this c5 square is weak, will be weak forever. So now knight c5, knight is situated, is placed ideally here, and the b file is open, as I said. So knight f4. So now that lines on queen side are open, now Bronstein does the same on the king side, f5. Now this rook on f8 becomes very active, and also, as you see, the king is on e file, so after the exchange, e4 will be weak, the rook can come to e8, so white is in trouble, f5. And white doesn't have any active plan. It's very difficult to create some threats, and it's not the case for black. For black, it's very easy to play. Black pieces are very active, while white doesn't know what to do. That's why white made a desperate move here. However, it's strong, maybe the best chance in the position. White decided to sacrifice piece, the knight, and start a strong attack and pressure on g file. So knight takes g6, h takes g, rook takes g6. So the idea is to double on g file to exert strong pressure, then probably play queen h6 and checkmate on g7. So Bronstein plays rook f7, defending g7 beforehand, rook g1, and now rook b8. So now rook is very active. And here white played rook g5. The idea of this move is to prevent black from exchanging a pair of rooks. For example, if white played here queen h6, creating checkmate threats, black would just exchange pair of rooks by playing rook b2 check, then rook b1 check, and exchanging rooks. And after this, white doesn't have any attack, any pressure on g file. The only weakness on g7 is defended by the rook, and white doesn't have any active plan. While black just starts a very strong attack by opening lines, by taking on e4, creating weakness. The rook becomes a monster, the bishop becomes very strong, and d3, bishop d4 check. So a lot of, after king moves, of course, a lot of ideas black has, while white has no ideas at all after the exchange of a rook pair. That's why it's important to retain both rooks in order to have some chances for attack. That's why white played rook g5 in order to keep both rooks on board. And here Bronstein, of course, played rook b2 check, king f1, f takes e, creating deadly threat, rook f3 check. f4 in order to keep the f file closed. And but now after f4, black has two connected central passed pawns. And e3. And here white made a fatal mistake. White played rook h5, threatening checkmate in one. However, it doesn't work. Bronstein in his book calls this rook h5 move too optimistic. So instead of rook h5, it was better to make a draw. It wasn't late to make a draw in this position by playing rook takes g7, rook takes, king takes, and now white has perpetual queen g5 check, and there is no way black king can escape the checks. However, white wanted to win and played rook h5. And now Bronstein, with simple but beautiful tactics, wins the game. So I offer you to pause the video and find these tactics. So the move is, of course, rook takes f4, check, and also queen is attacked. That's why white is forced to take the rook. And now e2 check. So now the king has 4 squares. If king goes either to e1 or to f2, it would be followed by knight d3 fork, check, and queen is lost. And if king goes to g2 or g1, then just promotion with check, and black wins in all cases. That's why after e2 check, white resigned.